when legendary big band leader Glenn Miller mysteriously disappeared during World War II. People spent decades trying to solve the mystery. What happened to him? Nearly 70 years later, in 2014, documents were discovered that shed light on this mystical story and revealed a startling truth. If there were rock stars in the swing era, Glenn Miller would certainly be one of them. Although his image rather resembled a respectable gentleman in a strict tuxedo and glasses, this did not prevent him from having millions of fans. His music was mesmerizing, his orchestra packed auditoriums, and his performance style became a benchmark for a generation. Like many iconic artists, he passed away too soon, leaving behind a lot of mysteries. His body was never found. The future king of the big band, Elton Glenn Miller, was born on March 1st, 1904, in Iowa. In the family, it was customary to address everyone by their middle name, so the boy became simply Glenn. In 1915, the Miller family moved to Nebraska. There, the teenager, wanting to earn money, began milking cows, saving money for his dream, a musical instrument. After collecting the necessary amount of money, he bought a trombone, which became his faithful companion for many years. He soon joined a local orchestra and began to master other instruments, including the mandolin and cornet. His passion for music was so serious that he even skipped his own high school graduation ceremony for an important performance. Subsequently, upon entering college, he continued to put music above academics, which eventually led to his expulsion. Rejecting a traditional education, Miller made a bid for a career in music. He moved to New York City and took up the study of an unusual system of composition, the Schillinger method, which was based on mathematical principles. During this period, he wrote a melody, which at first he called simply Miller's Melody. A few years later, this composition would receive a new name, Moonlight Serenade, and would become his calling card, one of the most recognizable hits in the history of jazz. But before that, he had to go through a serious ordeal. There was fierce competition among musicians in the metropolis. Glenn played trombone in the orchestra of Ben Pollock until he faced a serious rival. A new virtuoso trombonist appeared in New York, Jack Teagarden. His talent was so bright that he quickly began to intercept Miller's solos. Glenn, unwilling to settle for a secondary role, decided to change his focus. He delved into arranging and composing, realizing that this was where he could showcase his true talent. As his career began to gain momentum, he decided it was time for a change in his personal life as well. He already had a girlfriend he dated in college, Helen Berger. She had always remained somewhere on the periphery of his life, but now Glenn decided it was time to make her his wife. Her parents, however, were not enthusiastic about the idea. They doubted that a career as a musician could provide their daughter with a decent life. But Helen turned out to be a girl of independence. She rejected the objections of the family, moved to New York and married Miller, believing that he will be able to prove to her parents his wealth. Now Glenn faced a new task, not only to conquer the music world, but also to justify the trust of his wife, proving that he made the right choice. After securing financial backing from his friend, Simon Shribman, Glenn Miller set out to realize his long-held dream, creating his own orchestra. By the spring of 1938, things finally started looking up. He became well known in New York's musical circles and beyond. Then came the call that would change his career forever. He was invited to perform at Glen Island Casino, a venue that had launched the careers of many famous artists. When Miller and his band arrived at the venue, they were met with an astonishing surprise. 1,800 people had turned up for their concert. For a young musician, this was a staggering success. Within just a year, Miller's influence on the music industry had become undeniable. In 1939, Time magazine reported that of the dozen most popular songs in American jukeboxes, at least 2, and sometimes up to 6, belonged to his orchestra. Miller was taking America by storm. His version of Tuxedo Junction sold 115,000 copies in its first week alone, signaling that his career had reached new heights. On October 6, 1939, Glenn Miller reached a major milestone in his life. He performed at Carnegie Hall, a concert venue considered the dream of every musician. His popularity skyrocketed at an astonishing rate, and soon, Hollywood took notice. 20th Century Fox offered him the opportunity to compose music for their new musical film, Sun Valley Serenade, and even appear in it. In the end, he not only played a small role, but became the centerpiece of one of the most memorable musical sequences in film history. Although the movie was set at a ski resort in Idaho, the director wanted to include a piece that would truly showcase Miller's talent. The choice fell on Chattanooga Choo Choo, a song that had nothing to do with skiing, but that didn't matter. The final sequence lasted an impressive 8 minutes and included tap dancing, leaving audiences in awe. The song itself became the first ever gold record, selling over 1.2 million copies. However, Glenn Miller was not only a remarkable musician, but also a true patriot. When World War II broke out, he was determined to enlist in the military. However, 2 significant obstacles stood in his way. First, married men were not being drafted at the time. Second, his poor eyesight and need for glasses made him an unlikely candidate for service. But Miller refused to give up. He found another way to serve his country, through his musical talents. He sent a detailed letter to a U.S. Army general, outlining a groundbreaking idea: incorporating jazz into military music to boost soldiers' morale. His proposal was approved, and he was given a month to wrap up his affairs before deployment. On September 24, 1942, he officially bid farewell to his fans during a radio broadcast. His orchestra's final live performance took place at the Central Theater in New Jersey. That day marked the definitive end of his civilian musical career. However, his military service proved to be just as intense as his time as a civilian musician. He was responsible for screening personnel for military bands, recruiting new musicians, and leading a radio production unit, broadcasting from New York City. Despite his successes, his ideas faced strong opposition. Many military musicians were reluctant to abandon traditional styles, and Miller had to fight hard for the right to use jazz arrangements, such as Blues in the Night, for military marches. In the end, he won this battle and forever changed military music by infusing it with modern elements. In May 1944, the military base received an urgent telegram from General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in Europe, insisted that Glenn Miller and his orchestra were immediately sent to the front. Eisenhower was convinced it was Miller's music that could raise the morale of soldiers tired of the brutal fighting and constant tension. On June 19th of the same year, Miller arrived in London, in the very epicenter of the Second World War. His team was assigned a room in the office of BBC Radio, which was located in an area that was regularly bombed by the Luftwaffe. After barely arriving, Miller realized that the place was too dangerous for his musicians and initiated a move to a safer building. This decision turned out to be literally life-saving. The very next day, the BBC office was subjected to a devastating attack. As a result of the explosion, the building was completely destroyed, and the tragedy claimed the lives of 150 people. While in the UK, Glenn Miller worked closely with David Niven, a British officer who later became a famous Hollywood actor and Oscar winner. Together, they devised a plan to send the orchestra to France, where the musicians were to perform for the wounded in hospitals, as well as for soldiers on short leave from the front lines. However, the process of organizing the move dragged on. To speed up preparations, Niven promoted Miller to executive officer, allowing him to travel to France in advance to make all the arrangements to accommodate the orchestra. Niven originally booked a flight for Miller for December 14, 1944, but adverse weather conditions forced the airline to cancel the flight. The next day, however, Miller received an unexpected offer from Lieutenant Colonel Norman Bessel, who invited him to join him on a flight to Paris in a small single-engine Nordeuin Norseman airplane. According to official records, Miller was not authorized to be aboard this flight, but despite the lack of authorization, he did board the plane. As a result, his movement was not recorded in military records, and no one knew exactly where he went. On December 15, 1944, at about 2 p.m., the plane with Miller, Bessel, and the pilot took off from RAF Twinwood Farm Airfield. They were never seen again. The next morning, December 16th, the Allied forces were taken by surprise. One of the biggest battles of World War II, the Ardennes Offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. In the chaos of war, Glenn Miller's disappearance went virtually unnoticed. For 9 days, no one even realized that the legendary musician was missing. It was only after this time that the Allied command realized the loss. 2 high-ranking officers were sent to Helen Miller's home to personally break the tragic news to the conductor's wife. Helen was shocked. She and her husband had only recently adopted a baby girl named Johnny, but Miller never got to see her. The couple had also recently adopted a boy named Stephen, and the loss of her husband was a real blow to Helen. Realizing the magnitude of the tragedy, the military command decided to publicly announce Miller's disappearance. On December 24, 1944, Christmas Eve, the world was told the sad news. The famous bandleader Glenn Miller disappeared without a trace, and no one knew what happened to him. Despite the tragedy, the orchestra continued its mission. In the absence of its leader, Jerry Gray took over the conductor's desk, and the Christmas concert that was scheduled to go on as scheduled took place. Most people at the time believed that Miller's plane crashed due to bad weather conditions. There was thick fog in the sky that day, and the wings of the airplane could have been covered in an icy crust, leading to the crash. However, over time, other, sometimes quite exotic versions of what happened began to appear. Some researchers claim that the cause of the crash that resulted in the disappearance of legendary musician Glenn Miller could have been the actions of the German military. According to one theory, the plane Miller was flying was a deliberate target of attack. It is believed that he was on a secret mission, and the Germans not only shot down his plane, but may have captured him. However, there is another hypothesis, according to which the perpetrators were much closer to home. In 2000, a unique World War II flight logbook was auctioned at Sotheby's. The author of the records, Derek Terman, was in the air the very night Miller's plane disappeared. In his memoirs, he claimed he was on a bombing mission over German territory, and, as was often practiced, his crew dropped unspent bombs into the sea before returning to base. According to him, he and 3 crew members noticed a small airplane flying toward their course. It was probably Miller's plane, but the most shocking part of Terman's account is the confession of his radio gunner, who claimed to have seen with his own eyes the plane flip over and crash into the water. The area should have been free of any civilian or small military aircraft, raising a new question. Why was Miller's plane in the area in the first place? An unexpected answer to that question came decades later from a completely unexpected source. In 2012, One Senaran Anderton tried to sell his late brother's old notebooks on the TV show, Antiques Roadshow. It turned out that his brother had been an aviation observer in his youth and had scrupulously recorded in his notebooks all the airplanes that flew overhead. These records could shed light on the fate of Glenn Miller. After careful analysis, experts found that Miller's plane was indeed on its planned route and did not deviate from the course. This completely refuted the version about an accidental hit of dropped bombs in his plane. Nevertheless, another discovery brought the researchers closer to the truth. In 1987, a British fisherman pulled in his net's wreckage of a small airplane. However, unable to lift it aboard, he was forced to release the find back into the sea. Years later, he saw a photograph of Miller's plane and realized that the wreckage he found in 1987 could have belonged to that particular aircraft. With his help, authorities determined that the remains of the plane were near the coast of Dorset, England. This find could be the final solution to the mystery of Miller's disappearance. But to date, no conclusive evidence has emerged that this is indeed his plane. The International Historic Aircraft Recovery Team continues to study the crash site, but has not yet been able to provide definitive confirmation. Glenn Miller's son, Stephen, has faced numerous conspiracy theories about his father's fate over the years. Eventually, he decided to look into the circumstances of his disappearance on his own. To do this, he hired an expert on Miller's life, Dennis Sprague, who devoted many years to finding answers. His labors were not in vain. In the course of research, he discovered military documents that had not been previously studied. Based on these documents, Sprague concluded that the cause of the crash of Miller's plane was icing of the fuel lines, which caused the engine to fail, and the plane crashed into the waters of the English Channel. Unfortunately, Stephen himself did not live to see this theory officially recognized. He passed away in 2012, having never learned the final truth about the tragic fate of his father, the great Glenn Miller.